Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. If you're new to FFF, come and visit us at fff.org. Subscribe to our daily publication, the FFF Daily, for free. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel and who writes a weekly article that we publish at least weekly, and does a monthly article for our journal, Future of Freedom. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you, and for us to be with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, Richard, okay, one of the burning issues of our day, one that we've discussed in the past, but I think is worth exploring in more detail, is this concept of socialism. You've got the Democratic Party candidates that are debating the issue. Some of them call themselves socialists. Others are more reticent to use that label. You've got a system here in the United States where many people on the left castigate America's capitalist system. You've got people like Donald Trump and the Republicans defending what they call America's free enterprise system and the principles of free markets and limited government. And it's sort of this mishmash of understanding of what genuine liberty is all about. So I thought it's worth exploring this issue in more depth from a libertarian perspective, because the way we look at free enterprise is totally different from the way that Donald Trump and the GOP and the conservative movement and the leftist movement view free enterprise. When we think of free enterprise, we go back to the idea of Adam Smith's famous treatise in 1776, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. That when Smith was writing this book, he was looking back in history at periods of time where governments have always regulated economic activity and provided relief to the poor, waging war on poverty. This has been the standard role of government throughout history, to manage and regulate the economy and take care of the poor, and all with the idea of helping people so that they don't get exploited by employers or businesses or profiteers and the like. So in the Middle Ages, for example, you had anti-speculation laws and anti-middlemen laws, because the idea was that these speculators and these middlemen were taking advantage of the poor. So that was the standard fare. So Smith comes along and says, you know what? It's the exact opposite. The way to help the poor and the way to really help society to get higher standards of living is a system where you have an economic enterprise free of government control and management. So that's how the term free enterprise originates. It's a system where enterprise is free of government control and interference. And basically, with some exceptions, large and small, that's the kind of system Americans brought into existence. They were highly influenced by Smith's work in 1776, which was the same year as the Declaration of Independence. So with exceptions, you've got a system that comes into existence where there's no income tax or IRS, no Social Security, no Medicare, no Medicaid, no mandatory charity. People were free to keep everything they earned and decide for themselves what to do with it. There were no licensing and permits. If you wanted to be a lawyer or a doctor or whatever, you just trained yourself or went to school and then just opened up shop. If people wanted to patronize you, they could. If they didn't want to, they didn't have to. And then people decided for themselves what to do with their own money. So this was a very unusual system. It was a one-of-a-kind system. Nothing like it has ever existed in history. Throughout the 1800s, for about 100 years, no mandatory charity, and yet you had the most charitable nation in history come into existence, the most prosperous nation in history. Well, all that changes in the 20th century. So the big revolution came in the Franklin Roosevelt administration, where the federal government was converted to what we call a welfare state, which is a system of mandatory charity. That's when Social Security got established, laying the framework for Medicare and Medicaid and farm subsidies, education grants. It's where you get the warfare state, the national security state. But here was the brilliance of Roosevelt, is that he, in changing this system in a revolutionary way, he convinces Americans that it's all designed to save free enterprise, because his concept was free enterprise had failed. Well, we libertarians say it wasn't free enterprise that failed that brought the stock market crash in '29. It was the Federal Reserve, which had come into existence along with the income tax in 1916. That's what produces the Great Depression. But the brilliance of Roosevelt is he convinces people that this opposite kind of system, a system of mandatory charity and a managed economy, is really free enterprise, saving free enterprise. So that indoctrination comes across in the public school system, so that today you've got this huge monumental system of mandatory charity where really the government has nationalized people's income and decides what they're going to do with people's income, how much they're going to be permitting people to keep every year. Totally opposite to a system where you have a right to keep everything you earn and you decide what to do with it. And you've got a highly managed economy, government managed economy. This is why presidents run on the basis of I'll bring jobs to America. I'll make economic prosperity. This is what Trump is saying, that he's responsible for the prosperity in America because he's a government manager of the economy. You've got trade wars, tariffs, sanctions, embargoes, and it's all billed as a capitalist system, while it's totally opposite to the system that you and I call a free enterprise system. And so you've got the left attacking this system today as capitalism, when you and I attack the system because it is anti-capitalist. And I think what we need to do, Richard, is restore an understanding of what freedom really means. And that's a system where there is a separation of economy and the state, where the state is prohibited from regulating, managing, interfering with how people run their economic activities, and a system, again, where people are free to keep everything they earn and decide for themselves what to do with it. In other words, a genuine free enterprise system. Not a system where the government's managing and regulating, taxing economic activity, but where economic activity is totally free of government management, control, and taxation. What do you think?
Well, to sort of build on some of the things you've said, perhaps, again, always a little bit of history. The fact is, as you were saying, Adam Smith viewed himself as a critic of the political economic system of his time. The political economics of the mid and late 1700s, around the time when Adam Smith, as you said, was publishing The Wealth of Nations in 1776, was one that has become known as mercantilism. This was the idea that the government had the duty and the responsibility and should assign to itself the power to basically regulate most of what went on in the economic affairs of the king's subjects. Wage and price controls, government prohibitions and mandates on what could be produced or grown in both industry and agriculture within the domestic economy, the imposition of import prohibitions, high tariffs against various foreign manufactured goods, and at the same time, bounties, that is subsidies to try to sell your own domestic country's products in the other countries to try to enrich yourself. And these regulations of the 1700s were no less egregious or minute than, in fact, our federal government in the United States imposes today. For example, before the French Revolution in Imperial France, the regulations were so tiny and detailed that it specified the width of a collar on a woman's blouse, how many stitches should be used in attaching a button to a shirt, the types of crops and the amount of the crops that could be grown in different parts of France, the prices at which they could be sold, the wages that had to be paid, the means of transportation, to whom you could sell it, and under what sort of regulatory or prohibitory overseeing regulations. So this was the nature of the system. Adam Smith would not have called it, if we were to use this kind of jargon today, laissez-faire or capitalism. He would have considered it the heavily regulated and restricted government-managed economic system that serves special interests. Adam Smith is called the great defender of laissez-faire, but not the laissez-faire of the established order. He viewed that monopolies and cartels that could restrict production and push up prices were not the result of free markets, but precisely because the government interfered and gave privileges, favors, special benefits to selected groups that were around either the king himself, or in the case of Britain, would have influence with members of the parliament of that time. That's in fact what the American colonials were revolting against when they declared their independence in 1776. In an earlier segment of our show, we talked about the recent celebration of the Declaration of Independence. And I'll just reiterate for a moment that if you read the enumerated grievances in the Declaration, what are the American founding fathers primarily, not exclusively? They're concerned with personal freedom and civil liberties, egregious taxes. But what is a primary a grievance that they have against the British Crown? Government regulation of both the domestic manufacturing and trading of goods and services within the 13 colonies, and the right and opportunities of the residents of those 13 colonies to freely trade both with other parts of the British Empire and the world in general. So all of these people were revolting against a non-free market system, a corrupt, today we would call it crony political system. What they wanted was the liberation of the individual to be free to guide and direct and produce and interact with his fellows as he thought peacefully and honestly best to achieve his own ends. It's the reason why at a point in The Wealth of Nations where Adam Smith is discussing what would be the functions of a government in the world that he would like to see, he refers to it as a system of natural liberty. In other words, if you got government out of the way, and it is restricted to those narrow but essential functions: courts for the enforcement of the law, police to either capture violators of the law or to try to act as a deterrent, and then military defense because there can be bad bandits from outside who try to invade your country. But except for this and a few others, Smith then said this would be a system of natural liberty where each individual to pursue his own ends in his own chosen way, selecting the means that seems best, either in his own guiding activities or in his free, peaceful interactions with others in the marketplace, for the cooperative and mutual benefit of all the participants. And on top of that, he said that when you leave individuals free, not guided, controlled, commanded, directed, prohibited by the government, but free to peacefully interact with their fellow human beings, the system of voluntary exchange in division of labor is that each individual in his own self-interest applies his talents, his abilities, his productive capacities in ways to serve his fellow man. Because with freedom of enterprise and freedom of trade, the only way you can get what the other has that you desire is by offering him something in exchange that he will value more highly than what you're asking him to give up to you because you want it from him. So all of us benefit, and there emerges this wealth of nations through this spontaneous interaction of free men in free markets. That was the ideal of thinkers like Adam Smith, these leaders of what were called the Scottish Enlightenment, or the classical economists of the early 19th century, or the more covering term in terms of a political and policy view, the classical liberals of the time. You referred to FDR, if I can continue with this, elaborating a point of yours. You said that Franklin Roosevelt's trick was to say that these government regulations, interventions, controls, huge government spending projects were not meant to undermine or destroy capitalism, but to save capitalism. And what is the phrase, the term, the political covering term that came to be used to explain such an activist government involvement in social and economic affairs from the 1930s on? This was liberalism in the United States. This was a twisted misuse of the term. In the 19th century, liberalism meant that system of natural liberty of which Adam Smith spoke. The individual is free. He owns himself. He may not be enslaved, controlled, or abused by either private citizens or by the government that is meant to protect him. He has a right to his own private property and its peaceful and honest use, and its trade and exchange of it and its manufacturers with his fellow men, on any terms found mutually agreeable to the participants. Individuals, and therefore the market setting prices and wages, the prices of the resources and the labor services and the finished products. And each man is free to compete. That was the ideal of the liberal order, in a wider setting of equal rights before an impartial rule of law. No favors, no privileges, no special benefits for anyone, in a system of limited government with individual freedom for mutual benefit and peace and harmony and the prosperity of all, going beyond boundaries and encompassing an ecumenical notion of that these rights and freedoms should belong to all human beings everywhere for the benefit of the community of man. And Franklin Roosevelt and others around the same time come and twist this, where liberalism becomes not the laissez-faire of the free, peaceful, honest individuals interacting with each other, but a laissez-faire of government. Government is free to do whatever it wants. It can tax, it can regulate, it can spend, it can control, it can prohibit, it can surveillance, it can manipulate, it can intrude, it can confiscate, it can do anything that it wants, including wars and conquests. There are no limits to the state. The state is everything, and the individual becomes almost nothing, certainly much smaller. That is the twisted meaning of liberalism. Liberalism means what you and I have been talking about, what any friend of liberty means: the right of the individual to be a free citizen, controlling his own life in peaceful interaction with others for the spontaneous interactive benefit of mankind. And that is what the socialists want to reverse. They want to go back even more fully than exists today to command and control and to planning and to restricting and to redistributing, not through voluntary charity, but for the forceful hand of the policeman, taking something from one person without their consent and then paternalistically deciding it who they, the politicians, the bureaucrats, think it should have instead. They're mislabeling what our current system is. It is more like the mercantilism of which Adam Smith was a critic, and they're trying to label it as the free enterprise system, which has nothing to do with many aspects of the current political and economic system. And then they won't replace them with a system of tyranny and control that will eviscerate whatever freedom remains in our society.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the libertarian ideal in terms of what is the role of government in a free society. The three traditional roles of the police, capture murderers and rapists and thieves and people who violate the rights of others and prosecute them, and if convicted, punish them after following principles of due process, trial by jury, right to counsel, and so forth. And then provide a judicial system where people can resolve their disputes peacefully. They sue each other, and then they have a jury or a judge decide the case, and each side has a right to appeal the errors that they feel the judge has made. And then the traditional role of the government to protect against a possible invasion of the United States by some other nation state, which today is a virtually non-possibility. No nation state has the money or the resources or the manpower, the military, to cross the oceans and successfully invade and conquer the United States. So this is what we think of as libertarians. Now, when we look at the status quo, obviously we don't have that kind of system. We have a system where the CIA, the Pentagon, the NSA, what we call a national security state way of government, which is totally opposite from a limited government republic, which was the type of government America started out with, that is engaged in all these foreign wars and foreign interventions. And so you've got people on the left, the Bernie Sanders types, the socialist types, that say, oh, well, look how bad capitalism is because of all these foreign wars and all this militarism. Well, we indict this kind of system. That's not our kind of system. That's not what we define as a capitalist system. Our system is a libertarian system that is one where you have a limited government republic, where there's no big standing military establishment, so certainly no national security state, which is a totalitarian type of government system. It's a system where people keep everything they earn, no IRS or income tax, no mandatory charity. Everybody decides what to do with his own money. So we, like the left, attack much of what is involved in the American society today, but for different reasons. Because we live under this massive socialistic type of system with mandatory charity, massive militarist system, which is the national security state. So what we want to do is we want to dismantle this socialist experiment that really began with the progressives. In the late 1800s, they began importing their paradigm of government management of the economy, government control, government regulation, which was really a throwback to what had come before for eons, where governments had controlled and managed economic activity. This is where we start getting ideas for the minimum wage, the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, the idea of a national income tax, a graduated income tax, which became part of the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto, a central bank, a Federal Reserve, paper money, which abrogated America's system of legal tender, which was gold and silver coins, which the Constitution brought into existence, which had been our system for more than 100 years. So now you've got this irredeemable fiat paper money system that's brought into existence. You've got Roosevelt nationalizing gold, which was no different from what communist dictators were doing later on, nationalizing people's property. People were required to turn their gold coins into the government on pain of a felony conviction if they got caught hoarding gold. They were required to use now irredeemable paper notes, promises to pay as legal tender. You've got the whole system of mandatory charity. And it's all with this concept that this is free enterprise, that this is what America's free enterprise system is all about. Now, when we point out to the socialists where their system leads, we point to places like Venezuela, North Korea, Cuba, and where it's just a disaster, where you've got a system where the government's controlling, managing economic activity, and now today's socialists say, oh well, no, that's not what we have in mind. We're not talking about total socialism like in those countries. But think about it, Richard. What Castro did in Cuba, what Maduro's doing, and Chavez did in Venezuela, what the communists did in North Korea, is really the logical consequence of what the left here wants to do. That in Cuba, the government takes from the rich and gives to the poor. Well, instead of just taking something from the rich, they took everything from the rich. It was just a logical outcome of their belief structure. They just followed their principles to their logical conclusion. They nationalized not just gold, but everybody's homes and everybody's businesses. Everything became the property of the state. And instead of just regulating economic activity, they took control over economic activity. Everybody works for the state in Cuba, or most everybody. And so you have a centrally planned economy. No different from central planning and education that we have here today under public schooling systems. No different from central planning that we have in immigration controls. And of course, that produced nothing but chaos and crises. The same thing they produce here. You got a healthcare crisis with Medicare and Medicaid. You got an education crisis with public schooling. You got an immigration crisis. This is what Ludwig von Mises called planned chaos. This is what they bring into existence. Now, what they're trying to do in the left in saying, well, we don't really want that total socialist system. They're trying to reach this balance where the productive sector, they're plundering and looting to such an extent where it doesn't kill the private sector, but they have this massive public sector of mandatory charity and the national security establishment, and they try to reach a balance where they suck just enough blood out of the victim that they don't kill the victim. They're like parasites. The parasite doesn't want to kill his host. He just wants to keep sucking as much out of the host as he can. And that's the balance that these welfare states try to reach. Inevitably, though, it starts caving in on itself. For a while, the private sector can outproduce the parasites, And that's what's happened in the United States. It's been phenomenal how the private sector's been able to keep pace with what's been sucked out of this in terms of income taxation and debasement of the currency with the Federal Reserve. But ultimately, they go too far, and the victim starts to just cave in on itself. More and more people go on the welfare dole. More of them check out and retire early. So the productive sector starts shrinking while the parasitic sector starts expanding exponentially. And like we've seen in Greece, finally the whole thing caves in on itself. And that's ultimately what's going to happen here, because they never know when to stop. There's always more social programs that they want, more government spending. And what we really need in this country first is what does it truly mean to be free? What does that mean? What does free enterprise really mean? Does it mean government management and regulation of economic activity and mandatory charity? Or does it mean a way of life where people are free to keep everything they earn, in which enterprise is totally free of government control? What is limited government? Is it a giant national security state like North Korea has or Cuba has and like the United States has had since World War II? Or is it truly a limited government republic where the government's functions are limited to the three that you and I mentioned? So once people understand what it means to be free and what limited government really means, then we can start talking about, well, do you want that kind of system, a genuine free enterprise system, or do you want this socialist, interventionist, militarist system that is falsely sold and indoctrinated into people as free enterprise?
Yeah, the ambiguities show themselves in public opinion polls. The Pew Research Center recently did a survey and released the results on people's attitudes towards, quote, capitalism and, quote, socialism. And there's a schizophrenia in the general American public. In general, you have about 65% of the people in the aggregate saying, "Oh yeah, they're for capitalism." They have a positive view of capitalism. At the same time, in that same poll, in the aggregate for the population as a whole, you have something like 44% to 46% who say they have a positive view of socialism. Well, how can you have it both ways? Because what you basically have is a lot of people saying that they are positive about both. And at the same time, when the population as a whole is asked, well, what are your views towards socialism, positive or negative? There's a certain percentage that say that they're negative about socialism, but at the same time, you have these people who are saying that they're positive, they're negative about socialism. Now, what you basically have is this misunderstanding, and then it becomes even worse if you break it down according to the Pew Research Center. If you break it down to age groups and gender and so on, it becomes even more schizophrenic. But what this is basically suggesting, at least when I read this, is that people have no idea of what the systems mean. What is a free enterprise system, which is being labeled capitalism? What is a command and plan system, which is, of course, socialism? What people believe is that you can have both. They want to go into a restaurant and, like, a la carte off the menu, I want column A and B from the capitalism column, and I want B and C from the socialism column. And can't I just put it together? We'll have some free enterprise. Of course, we have to have some personal liberties. But can't we combine that with national health care or some kind of guaranteed medical treatment? And can't we have a minimum wage and redistribution for the really poor? And so why can't we have the best of both worlds? And people do not understand, what a free economic system versus a command economic system really mean conceptually. And they don't have an understanding that, in fact, you can't mix the two together. You can have a mishmash as we have right now, but it leads to contradictions, inconsistencies, imbalances, distortions, potential stagnations, and an immense amount of corruption. And the corruption, which everybody complains about and knows is the nature of politics, is that when government has the ability to bestow privileges and favors upon selected individuals and groups, everyone is going to want to eat at the trough of political largesse, to receive some portion of it at other people's expense, because the government has no money to spend and no power to give something to someone else unless they take that money or some freedom from another. And it is vitally important to recapture the meaning of a system versus a command economic system, and to help Americans understand that at the end of the day, you can have these mishmashes, but they're internally inconsistent. And invariably, the more you mishmash them together, the more the political replaces the freedom part. And eventually, it has such a momentum that it's difficult to reverse before you have a disaster like we saw a few years ago in Greece.
Yeah, those are absolutely fascinating points. And in fact, I think there's a perverse logic in why Americans favor socialism in certain areas. You see, if you've been indoctrinated into believing and you're convinced that America is a free enterprise country, then when you see problems arise, like in education or healthcare or immigration, a host of other areas where there's massive government intervention, if you believe this is free enterprise, then your natural tendency is to say, well, this obviously isn't working. Free enterprise just isn't working. Maybe we do need to look at socialism. But for those of us who have a grip on this reality, we know that the reason there's these crises in these areas is precisely because they are socialist programs. Right. Immigration is central planning. That's a core feature of socialism. Public schooling, you couldn't find a better example of a socialist structure than public schooling. It's a government system. It's centrally planned. Mandatory attendance, mandatory taxation to fund it. Medicare and Medicaid, occupational licensures. These are all government interventions, socialist programs, taking from one group of people and giving to another group of people. So for us, the solution to these is freedom and free enterprise, free markets. Abolish, dismantle the immigration controls, the public schooling system, the Medicare and the Medicaid. So it's all logical for us to favor freedom. But if you believe that this is freedom and free enterprise, and you're convinced that this is part of America's free enterprise system, then it stands to reason that you're saying, well, this thing has failed, I guess we better try socialism. So there's sort of a perverse logic with people who favor, in a general sense, free enterprise, because that's what they've been taught to favor as Americans. You know, you can't be a real American unless you favor the free enterprise system. But since they believe that it's failing, like in monetary policy, which is another example of a socialist central planning system, then your natural tendency is to say, hey, let's try something different. And let me also point out something here, that you've got a high rate of suicide in America, especially among young people. You've got also massive alcoholism, massive drug addiction and stuff. I can't help but believe that part of the psychosis that goes on in this is this denial of reality, that people honestly believing they live in a free society. And I think any psychiatrist will tell you that when you're living a life of a lie, a life that denies reality, it's going to have major impact on you, developing psychoses. And whenever I see a young person checking out of life early, I think to myself, I wonder if what goes through that person's mind is that this is a free society. Well, if this is the best there is, if this is what freedom produces, I want no part of it. But if they knew that this is not a free society, if they had a grip on that reality the way that we libertarians do, I wonder if it might not affect them and say, well, okay, now it makes sense why there's so much dysfunctionality in American society, precisely because it's not a free society. Maybe I'll stick around and join up with the libertarians to really achieve a free society in our country.
Well, I just sort of, as a footnote to what you just said, it isn't so much, I think that, there are many reasons why a person becomes so desperate to take their own life. Family circumstances, personal tragedies, psychological problems that have nothing per se to do with politics, obviously. But I do believe that there's often a sense of despondency. I have no future. I'm locked into the society in which I was born. I have nothing to look forward to. And isn't so much that they think in the more explicit terms that you're suggesting, but they have this sense of being lost and having no ability to give meaning or direction or purpose to their own life. And part of that has to do with the fact that the institutional setting in which they find themselves living, even though they never conceptualize it or have the ability to articulate it, has narrowly confined and straitjacketed them with narrowed opportunities and shortened horizons about what is possible for their life. It's notorious that in countries that are far more interventionist and socialist-like than ourselves, such as in Europe, you have parts of the society where unemployment rates perpetually, not just during a recession, for the young, defined as 25 years and younger, is 35%, 50% of that age group. Well, what's your future? You're living at home, or you're getting government welfare. You've been assigned some government department, perhaps, particularly in France, in these satellite communities away from the centers of job opportunities and culture and the vibrancies of the society in general. You're locked into these cages with nothing to look forward to but your next welfare check, regardless of the particular country, what they call that welfare check, and the in-kind handouts. And what you have to look forward to, and it's not that they think about it conceptually as, oh, it's the state doing this, but it's a life that they've been born into that seems to offer them no happiness or future to look forward to. In other words, the vibrancy of seeing a frontier to be making part of your life.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see a comparison of suicide rates among young people in the 1800s versus today. In the 1800s, where people were flooding into America from overseas, desperately poor, but a chance to do well, and the dynamism of that economy, engaging in occupational endeavors without getting a license or a permit, keeping everything you earn, deciding how to live your life the way you want. My hunch is that the suicide rate among young people was very, very low throughout the 1800s. Let me wrap it up by my favorite quote, which I think captures the plight of the American people, except libertarians. None are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free. And that was Johann Goethe. So on that note, Richard, we'll wrap it up. We're out of time. Greatly enjoyed the conversation as always, and look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time, and again, thanks to our viewers and listeners for sharing a little bit of their time with us.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for your comments, and thanks for your support. Come to our website. We're seeking some mid-year support here to bring FFF's principal case for liberty to a larger audience of people. You can read about that on our website at fff.org. We greatly appreciate the support you give us, and if you could lend us an extra hand on this particular project, we'd be very, very appreciative. So thanks for tuning in. Richard, see you next week.
Till next time.